And then it says, we're heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we may also be glorified with him. And so some people, again, turn this into works. And so they say, you have to make sure you endure persecutions and sufferings in order to be glorified, in order to confirm your salvation and make sure you're saved. And that's not what this is saying. Suffering with Christ is simply being united with Christ in his death. In order to be saved, you need to be united with Christ in his death. How does that happen? By having faith in Christ. It doesn't happen by your law keeping, by your enduring persecutions. Now, if you are born again, truly born again and a child in the kingdom, you will just endure persecutions. But we don't endure persecutions in order to become a child of God. Because we're a child of God, we can endure persecutions. And so when did Christ suffer? He suffered on the cross. And when do we suffer with Christ? When we had faith in Christ, we suffered with Christ. And so in order to be an heir of God, you have to be born again. You have to have suffered with Christ. And so Christ suffered. He did what we couldn't do. If it was up to our suffering, none of us would be able to suffer. Because it's talking about suffering the wrath of God, the condemnation of God, the judgment of God. None of us could have suffered that. Jesus had to suffer it for us, and he did. And so when we have faith in Christ, that's when we suffer with Christ. And that is when we become children of God. And that is when our spirit was glorified with him. And then one day, because we are born again, one day at the end of the age when Christ returns, our flesh will also be glorified with him. We'll be changed in the twinkling of an eye to become like him, his flesh, glorified flesh. And so in the meantime, because we are born of God and children in the kingdom, because of that, now we can suffer through trials and tribulations of this world, persecutions, all of that. And in fact, verse 18 says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." And so what is this really talking about? I believe he's talking about suffering in this life in the body. Because we are still in the body, our body is weak. Okay, we have the weakness of our body. And so we are treasures in jars of clay. Our spirit is born of God. Our spirit is glorified, but we live in a body that's not glorified. So we have a weakness. So we actually, in this earth, we're suffering through the weakness of our flesh. And because of that, there's different kinds of sufferings that we will endure. And so the suffering could also include persecution, tribulations, hardships, struggling, suffering through temptation because of the weakness of our flesh. When our flesh is glorified and we're in heaven, temptation is not even going to be a thing. There's not going to be struggling and suffering in heaven because we're going to be glorified, made perfect in every way. And so we won't be suffering anything in heaven. But while we're here on earth, in the weakness, living in the weakness of our flesh, we have to suffer certain things. And so Paul is saying any suffering we could face now while on earth is not even worth comparing to the glory that's going to be revealed in us. One day, God is going to glorify our flesh, and our flesh is going to become glorified, perfect, eternal. Our mortality is going to be swallowed up by immortality, and we will receive eternal bodies, and we will be with God in glory forever and ever. And that is our eternal hope. That is what we have to look forward to. And that's going to be for all eternity. This earth right now is for a moment. It's just a brief moment in eternity. And though it might seem like a long time, in reality, it's very brief. And then we're going to step into eternity, into glory. And any suffering on earth is just going to be a distant memory compared to all the glory we're experiencing in heaven.